Screws and Testimonies is a collection of creative writing. It's written by almost 50 authors who have connections to Mennonite or Anabaptist traditions, and they're writing in response to the Martyrs Mirror. It's almost a who's who of Mennonite writers. There are plenty of established authors. There are also some new writers who perhaps have seen their first publication in this book. The Martyrs Mirror is a huge old book compiled in 1660 by Thielemann J. Van Braght, and it's a collection of accounts of Anabaptist martyrs who suffered and died for their faith. And I think it's best known for the gory accounts of torture, but it also has court records, letters. There are love letters in there. There are accounts of miracles. There are revenge fantasies. There are rants about buying textiles from foreign countries and other luxuries that were in contemporary Holland for Thielemann J. Van Braght. So it's a big, complex book. A group of Mennonite scholars gathered a couple of years ago to talk about the upcoming 350th anniversary of the Martyrs Mirror. That was in 2010. And one of the ideas that they had was to collect some of the creative work that's out there in response to the Martyrs Mirror. And I had written an essay, it's one of the opening essays in the book, entitled Me and the Martyrs, and presented it at a Mennonite writing conference. And they thought, oh, Kirsten might be interested in this. And I was. The idea really caught fire with me. And so from that initial idea, just to find material that's written about the Martyrs Mirror, I winnowed it down a little bit. I was looking for work that was accessible to a general audience, work that told a story, and that helped to answer the question, who are we as either spiritual or perhaps genetic descendants of these martyrs? We put out a call for new work, and then I also spent a lot of time in EMU's historical library reading through already published material and finding really that a lot of Mennonite writers have at some point engaged the Martyrs Mirror because it's such a pivotal text for our people. We put the Martyrs Mirror on our wedding registry, and I'm not entirely sure why. I hadn't done a lot of reading in it or studying it, but I remember hearing some of the stories, the story of Dirk Willems, the story of Macon Venz, from my father, or perhaps in Sunday school, Bible school, when I was quite small. And I had a sense that this was a book that had influenced the direction of the church, and the memories recorded in the Martyrs Mirror are a big part of our identity. And so as I continued to explore my Mennonite identity, I wanted to have a copy of the book. A few of them, I think, well, Dallas Weeb, who has the final poem in the book, but most of them are contemporary living authors. I hope that it will help to encourage Mennonites and people of other faiths to read their own history appreciatively and also critically, to spend more time with it and to think about how it affects them. I also hope that it will encourage people to find their own voices in whatever way. I do it in writing, but find their own voices to explore their identity as people of faith. I think, again, it's important to know where we came from. It's important to know our history, to be inspired by the people who came before, to understand some of the baggage of what came before. I spoke to a woman at conference just yesterday who had seen the book, and she said, "Oh, I'm so glad you did that." She said, "We need to learn to laugh a little bit at the Martyrs Mirror." She said, "The Martyrs Mirror, that is a piece of work." And I think we take these sacred texts or historical texts and either sort of set them up on the shelf and say they are so sacred, they're so miraculous, that we distance ourselves from the humanity of them. Or on the other hand, we do sometimes distance ourselves through humor, through just sort of discounting the whole martyr thing. Either, oh my goodness, those stories are so gory that they're absurd, or maybe making fun of it in some less constructive way.
But you can't really relate to it as a person.
Right, and I think it's important to look at these historical documents and say these were people under very very difficult circumstances, doing the best they knew how to do. They sacrificed incredibly. They gave their lives, they gave away their children. There's a story of a woman who handed off her child on her way to be burnt at the stake to a stranger, whoever in the crowd could take him and house him. And I think those stories affect us deeply. Yes, I hear from a lot of people after readings who either go home and just probe the Martyrs Mirror further, either in their own copy or they look it up online because they've heard some stories that they didn't know were in there and they want to find more. I've also heard, and this is my favorite response, is when people go home and start to write after hearing this. Maybe they're writing about their own experiences with the Martyrs Mirror. Maybe just hearing the work of these poets and writers is enough to make them think, what story do I have to tell? And there's a really lovely article that just came out in the most recent Dream Seeker by Cynthia Page, who is a relative by marriage twice, but she is new to the Mennonite world, and her article is just a reflection on attending a reading of this book and being nervous about going to this thing with all the gory stories. I think she just came because she knew me. And then finding herself really longing for some sort of connection to some big book, to some story in her own history, and starting to search for that. Some parts of the book do. I think there's some poets especially who just very wonderfully and sensitively take you into the experience of the martyrs. And it's good literature. So it's I think they do a better job than Thielemann and J. Van Braght in that they don't distance you with a lot of graphic details, but they describe it so beautifully, so aesthetically, that even though it's horrible, it's moving, and it creates a picture that has a lot of resonance. This first excerpt comes from my essay entitled Me and the Martyrs, where I'm exploring this book and exploring some family history. The distance between me and the martyrs is a comfortable one. I can imagine them from afar like classical heroes. I don't know whether any of the martyrs in the book are my ancestors. We moved and lost so much, left generations behind on the journey across the Atlantic, lost too many stories in the translation from German to English. We have no souvenirs to hold. There is a wide white space between us. If I pursue them and they turn back to close the gap and grasp my hands, what will I do? Oh, here's a favorite first line. I'll just read. It's very short. It's from Anna Maria Johnson's short story, Fire. And it's an example of one of the stories that doesn't spend much time back in the Martyrs Mirror, but it writes about someone in the present who is affected by those stories. When Juliana was 16, she hoped to be burned at the stake. Oh, here's a piece from one of Julia Kasdorf's essays. It is a matter of consequence that the word witness means not only to see, but also to speak. To write like a martyr means not to choose death, but to choose to bear life, giving witness, to communicate the truth of one's own vision or insight, to affirm its value with confidence, no matter how arrogant or disturbing it may be, and the truth shall make you free. This comes from Ross L. Bender. Mennonites have great trouble perceiving the multidimensionality of their psychic situation. The juxtaposition of the average Franconia family with some particularly nasty piece of torture from the 16th century induces a sort of muted neurosis. Consider some of the elements in this emotional milkshake. A venerable Anabaptist saint barbecued to a crisp. A homeless, dying, and rising God who preached the power of powerlessness and that the rich would be consigned to hell. 1 BMW. Considerable financial assets, but you couldn't really call me rich, especially compared to those Wampler Longacres down the road. A profound sense of humility and a profound sense of pride in my spiritual heritage. The tongue screw was, it's actually, I found as we were editing this book, I was doing some historical checking, and a number of poets and writers, including me, had the impression that the tongue screw was a screw that you would use to, say, screw the tongue to your cheek or to the roof of your mouth. And the purpose, of course, was to keep you from speaking or singing or witnessing as you went into the public arena to be killed. But we found out, and actually did some edits to this end, we found out that the tongue screw is actually, it's a clamp that is placed on the tongue and then heated in such a way that your tongue is immobilized and injured so that you can't speak. And there's one of the better known stories from the Martyrs Mirror is the story of Macon Venz, whose young sons went to watch her execution, and after she was burnt, they sifted through the ashes, looking for some remnant of her to keep, and they found her tongue screw, and I believe that's still somewhere in a museum. It was handed down over the generations. Wow. And so it's in the book title as it stands for that inability to speak versus the ability to testify. And I think for Mennonites, that has been an ongoing theme. Are we quiet? Are we loud? Do we witness quietly? Do we witness verbally? So.